Hey there, settle in. Tonight's story isn't about kings or battles. It's about dirt, grass, sky, and a really asterisk cold winter. It's about ordinary people who bet everything on a piece of paper and 160 acres of maybe nothing. First, picture the place. The Dakota Territory, 1880. It's not a state yet. It's space. Miles and miles of rolling prairie grass that goes on forever, meeting a sky so big it makes you feel tiny. It's quiet out there. Not an empty quiet, but a living one. The wind whispers through the bluestem grass. Birds call. It's beautiful, but it's not forgiving. This is the stage. Now, meet the main characters, the homesteaders. Thanks to President Lincoln's Homestead Act, for just $1.25 an acre, you could claim 160 acres of this land. All you had to do was live on it, build a house, farm it for 5 years. It was the ultimate deal. The American dream, delivered via pamphlet to crowded cities in Europe and the East Coast. So, they came. Families from Norway, Germany, Russia, and from other American states. They packed their lives into a single wagon. A plow, some seed, a milk cow if they were lucky, a few pieces of furniture, and a mountain of hope. They'd get off the train in a raw little town, get directions to their claim, and then just start walking into the grass until they found their patch, their piece of the promise. The first order of business, shelter. And since there were maybe 3 trees in the entire county, you couldn't build a log cabin. So, you built what the land gave you, a sod house, a soddy. Let's talk about building a soddy. It's exactly what it sounds like. You take a special plow and cut the prairie turf into long, thick bricks of grass, roots, and dirt. Then you stack them, grass side down, like really heavy, messy Legos. You make walls about 2 feet thick. For a roof, you lay cottonwood poles across the top, then more sod. The whole thing is basically a living, breathing cave. Now, a soddy had charms. In summer, it was cool, it was free, it was yours. But it had personality. When it rained, it dripped mud inside for days. Bugs and the occasional snake would drop from the ceiling to say hello. The walls never stopped settling, but it was a fortress against the wind, and for the first winter, it was home. Inside that 16 by 20 foot dirt room, an entire family lived, cooked, slept, and dreamed. Mom, dad, 6 kids, maybe a grandparent. Everything happened in that one room. So, daily life was close. Dad and the older boys were out on the land from dawn. Breaking the prairie with a plow was back-breaking work. The grassroots were tough as steel cables. They'd fight to plant wheat, corn, or the magic crop, flax. They'd build barns for the few animals. They were fighting the land to make it feed them. Mom's world was the soddy and the yard, cooking on a Castrian stove that was always hungry for fuel-dried grass twists or precious cow chips, cleaning dirt that literally made up the walls. Hauntingly lonely work. The nearest neighbor might be 2 miles away. A trip to town for supplies was a major expedition, maybe once a season. The kids, they had chores, fetching water from the creek or well, minding younger siblings, and if they were lucky, they might go to school. The schoolhouse was another soddy, maybe 3 miles away. 1 room for all ages, 1 exhausted teacher. The walk there and back was your gym class, your nature study, and your social time all in one. What did they do for fun? Not much we'd recognize. In the evening, by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, Dad might fiddle with a repair. Mom would mend clothes. Someone might read from the Bible or an old newspaper aloud. They'd talk. They'd tell stories from the old country. They'd sing. The silence outside was so complete that their own voices were the most important sound in the world. Community was everything, and also terrifyingly fragile. A neighborhood was families scattered like distant stars. You knew a visit was coming when you saw a speck on the horizon that slowly turned into a wagon. A barn raising or a threshing bee was a major party. The only time you'd see other people for weeks. You'd work hard all day, share a big meal, and the kids would play. These connections were your safety net. If you got sick, if your crop failed, if your well went dry, these distant dots on the map were your only hope. The winter of 1880 approached like any other. The prairie gold turned to brown. The air got crisp. They'd been through Dakota winters before. They were tough. They had their routines. They'd slaughtered and preserved some meat. They'd stored root vegetables in pits. They'd piled sod against the house for extra insulation. They'd checked their fuel pile. Hay, corn cobs, maybe some precious coal if they could afford it. They'd watch the sky, of course. Old-timers and newcomers alike swapped weather wisdom, the thickness of corn husks, the behavior of birds, the ache in a bad knee. They knew blizzards could come. They called them northerners. They were fierce, but you hunkered down, waited a day or two, and it passed. This winter, though, started weirdly. November was mild, so mild that folks were still out and about in January. Kids went to school in lighter coats. It felt like a break, a gift. Maybe this would be an easy one. They had no idea. None. Because the thing about the prairie is, it lulls you. The vast quiet feels peaceful. The endless sky feels open and free. You forget that all that space is just a runway for weather. There's nothing to stop a storm for 1,000 miles. It can build and build out of sight, gathering a terrible power, and then just arrive. They were about to learn the true meaning of a Dakota winter. Not the cold they knew, but a living, screaming, white monster that would test every single thing about them: their house, their supplies, their ingenuity, and their will to see that tiny green shoot of spring. But that's a story for next time. For now, just picture the family in their saldi as night falls on a calm, cold evening in early January. The lamp is lit. The stove glows. There's a pot of stew simmering. The children are asleep under heavy quilts. The wind outside is just a gentle sigh against the thick walls. All is well. All is prepared. For now. So, our settlers are tucked into their sadies. It's January. They've done this before. They're tough. A little snow. A bit of wind, please. They've got stew on the stove and thick quilts on the beds. January 12th, 1881. Started nice. Weirdly nice. After a cold snap, the temperature shot up. In some places, it was near 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That's t-shirt weather for a Dakota January. Snow on the ground started to melt. Kids ran to school without their heaviest coats. Men were out checking on livestock, thinking they'd gotten a lucky break. It felt like a spring thaw, a gift in the middle of winter. But if you knew how to listen, the prairie was whispering a different story. Old-timers might have felt it in their bones. The air had a weird, heavy feeling. The birds had vanished. No chickadees, no jays. An eerie quiet settled in, deeper than usual. The wind, which always talked, went completely silent. It was the calm before the, well, not a storm, something else. Then, around noon in western Dakota, the wind came back, but not its normal sighing self. It came from the north, and it came with a roar. And with it, the temperature began to plunge fast. You could almost watch the thermometer drop. And then came the snow. This wasn't gentle, Christmas card snow. This was a solid, moving wall of white. The wind, now screaming at 60 miles an hour, didn't let the snow fall. It threw it horizontally. It's called a ground blizzard. The snow isn't just new snow. It's every flake that's already on the ground, picked up and hurled at your face. Visibility went from miles to zero in seconds. Literally zero. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The world became a furious, blinding, white void. If you were outside, you were instantly lost, completely and utterly disoriented. The familiar landmarks, a lone tree, a fence line, the slope of a hill were erased. The sun was gone. The sky was gone. The ground was gone. There was only deafening wind and stinging ice. The temperature dove to 40 below zero, and with that wind, it felt like 70 below. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Now, imagine the scenes playing out across 1,000 scattered claims. For the kids in the one-room schoolhouse, the day turned to panic. The teacher, often a young woman, barely older than her students, had a terrible choice. Dismiss the children to try and find their homes in the chaos, or keep them in a building that might not have enough fuel to last. Many sent them home. Children as young as 5 stumbled out into the white madness, trying to follow fences or creeks they could no longer see. For a farmer like Mr. Kaufman, who'd been out mending a fence a half-mile from his Saudi, the situation was instantly life or death. He turned toward where home should be and started walking. Within 10 steps, he had no idea if he was walking toward his house, toward the open prairie, or in a circle. The wind was so loud he couldn't call for help. He was alone in a universe of howling white. Inside the saddies, the sound was terrifying. The wind didn't whistle. It screamed against the corners of the roof, trying to claw its way in. Snow packed itself against the door like a concrete wall. The tiny window, if they had one, was just a solid, vibrating sheet of white. The world they knew had vanished. replaced by this roaring, shaking box of dirt they were sitting in. The first horrible realization wasn't about food or fuel. It was about time. This wasn't going to be a one-night blow. This was different. This had the feel of something biblical. The settlers huddled around their stoves, feeding in precious twists of hay or corn cobs, and listened to the fury outside. They looked at their woodpile. They looked at their food stores. They counted heads, and they knew, in their guts, that this was a siege. They were in a fight, not for a day, but for survival. Some stories from that first afternoon break your heart. A homesteader a mile from his house tried to run for it. They found him weeks later, frozen, just 100 yards from his barn. Another, thinking he could beat the storm, tried to travel to a neighbor's. His body was found in the spring, still holding the reins of his horse and wagon, both gone the wrong way. But other stories define the human spirit. A schoolteacher, seeing the blizzard hit, kept every child inside. She burned desks and chairs to keep them warm. She had them sing at the top of their lungs to fight the terror. She saved them all. Back in the soddy, our family is holding on. The storm is so thick, it's getting dark inside, even though it's only mid-afternoon. Dad makes sure the latch on the door is secure. Mum lights the kerosene lamp, a tiny defiance against the gloom. The children are quiet, wide-eyed, listening to a sound they've never heard before, the sound of the world ending. They are safe. For this moment, they are safe. The 2-foot-thick walls of earth are holding. The roof, for now, is holding. But the question hangs in the smoky air, unspoken but heard by everyone. How long? Outside, the white hurricane owns everything. It scours the land, fills every ditch, smothers every path. It doesn't care about promises or deeds or dreams. It is pure, ancient force. And it has only just begun. Next time, the math of survival. How do you make a cup of water last 3 days? What do you burn when the firewood is gone? The incredible, quiet inventions of people with their backs against a dirt wall. But for now, just be grateful for your roof, your walls, your warmth. Some nights, that's everything. Sleep well. Inside the soddy, time changed. The howling wind outside made minutes feel like hours, and hours feel like forever. The first frantic fear asterisk. What is happening? Asterisk settled into a colder, quieter reality. Asterisk, how do we outlast it? Asterisk, this became a math problem. A life or death math problem, with 4 variables: heat, water, food, sanity. Let's start with heat. The stove is the heart of the home. Without it, you're just in a frozen dirt cave. You start with your prepared fuel, the neat pile of hay twists, the basket of corn cobs, maybe a little stack of precious wood. You burn it carefully. Too little, and you freeze. Too much, too fast, and you'll have nothing in 2 days. But the storm isn't stopping. Your pile is shrinking. So, you start the great indoor burn-off. That stool with the wobbly leg. Firewood. The crate you carried your china in. Firewood. Shelves. Firewood. You become an interior decorator whose only theme is flammable. In some houses, they got desperate. They'd rip up parts of the floor, the actual floorboards they'd carried so far. They'd burn their precious seed grain, watching next year's food go up in smoke to save today's lives. One family, the story goes, burned their front door. They then spent the rest of the storm huddled in the back of the house, piling all their furniture and bedding into the doorway to block the blizzard that now had a direct invitation inside. Heat, you see, always won. But heat brought a silent, sneaky killer. The bad air, carbon monoxide. With the door snowed shut and the window blocked, the only ventilation was the stovepipe poking through the sod roof. If that got clogged with snow, and it often did, the smoke had nowhere to go but back inside. Families would get dizzy, get headaches, fall asleep and never wake up. So part of the math was Dad risking a quick shovel at the roof vent, or Mum insisting a tiny crack be cleared by the door, letting in a sliver of that deadly cold to keep the air inside safe to breathe. Next variable, water. You have a bucket full. Great, that's for today. What about tomorrow? You can't go out to the well. The answer is all around you, in the walls and drifting against the door. Snow. But you can't just eat snow. That lowers your body temperature, a death sentence. So, you have to melt it, which uses fuel, which brings us back to the heat problem. So, you take a pot, you pack it with snow, and you place it near the stove, not directly on it, letting the ambient warmth do the work slowly, saving the big heat for cooking. A pot of snow could take hours to become 2 cups of water. It was a lesson in patience. Now, food. The careful stores looked different now. That sack of beans isn't dinner for the month, it's a countdown clock. So, you invent. You take a handful of flour, mix it with melted snow water, and make a paste you cook into a bland, filling gruel. You take the last bony scrap of salt pork and boil it, then boil it again tomorrow, and again the day after, until the broth is so thin it's just salty, greasy water. It still feels like a meal. The most famous and desperate trick was pioneer leather soup. If you had a pair of old leather shoes or a harness you weren't using, you could cut it into strips, boil it for hours, and drink the broth. The leather itself, supposedly, became soft enough to chew. I don't know if it's true, but the fact that people talked about it tells you about the kind of ideas that were on the table. The children's role shifted. Their job was to conserve asterisk. Don't fidget too much, you'll waste energy. Stay under the quilt in a heap with your siblings, sharing body heat like a litter of puppies. Tell stories to the little ones to keep them from crying, because crying takes energy. They became tiny, serious partners in the math, which brings us to the final, hardest variable, sanity. The mind. The unending scream of the wind could drive you mad. The dark, smoky gloom of the single room could feel like a tomb. The fear for your children, for your animals, for your distant neighbors could eat you from the inside. So, they fought back with routine and ritual. Mom would insist the breakfast dishes be wiped, even if breakfast was a shared crust. Dad would sharpen tools that didn't need sharpening. They would tell long, elaborate stories. They would sing every hymn they knew. They would recite every poem they remembered. One little girl, years later, recalled her father making a daily inspection of the walls, pretending to check the fortifications against the White Army outside. He made it a game. He gave them a role. He gave them courage. They played games with nothing. Button games, string games, shadow puppets by the candle. They kept the mind busy, because an idle mind in that situation would turn to despair. And through it all, they listened, not just to the storm, but for breaks in it, for a change in the wind's pitch, for a moment of silence that might mean it was over. That silence never came, just the endless, exhausting roar. 72 hours, 3 days. That's how long this first, worst blast went on. 3 days of calculating every twig burned, every sip of water, every crumb of food, every word spoken to keep hope alive. When the wind finally dropped to a groan on the 4th morning, it wasn't relief they felt, it was dread. Because when they managed to dig out the door and peek, they didn't see the world. They saw a smooth, endless, terrifying ocean of solid white. Drifts were 20, 30 feet high. Their barn was a vague mound. The fences were gone, the path was gone, and the sky to the north was still dark with the next wave. The siege wasn't over. It had just finished its first attack. They had passed the first test, but they were weaker, with fewer resources, and now they knew the enemy's true strength. The math just got harder. Next time, the long haul, weeks in the white, when the emergency becomes your life, and you have to find a new normal at the end of the world. But for tonight, just think about the simple things: a warm drink, a full cupboard, a quiet house. Sometimes, history's greatest miracles are the ordinary things that survive the storm. Sleep well. For a few hours, maybe half a day, the wind stopped screaming. The world was silent, but it was a deafening silence. People would dig out their doors, blinking in the weak grey light, and look at what was left. It wasn't their farm. It was a sculpture of their farm, made of solid snow, a smooth, rolling desert where every hollow was filled, every fence buried, every familiar shape softened into anonymity. They'd have just enough time to feel that dread settle in their stomachs. How will we ever dig out of this? When the wind would pick up again from the northwest, a new bank of clouds, darker than the last, would come marching over the horizon. And by nightfall, the white hurricane was back, replastering the door they'd just cleared, filling their world with that familiar, furious roar. This became the pattern for weeks. A day of quiet, 2 days of storm, a half day of clearing, 3 days of storm. January bled into February. The calendar became meaningless. The only measure of time was the shrinking of the woodpile, the emptying of the flour sack, and the growing tightness in everyone's chest. This was no longer an emergency. This was their new life, and they had to learn to live it. First, communication was dead. No one knew if their neighbors were alive or dead, thriving or starving. That loneliness was a heavy blanket. You might see a smudge of smoke on the far horizon during a calm spell aside someone else was burning their table to stay alive, but that was it. You were an island in a frozen sea, wondering if you were the last island left. Then came the body's betrayals. Frostbite, for those who had to venture out for fuel. Fingers and toes turning white, then black. The treatment was brutal, slow, painful, thawing by the stove, if you could stand the pain. If not, you risked gangrene. Colds turned into deep, racking coughs that echoed in the sadi with no medicine to treat them. And the most terrifying of all, a woman going into labor, with no midwife, no doctor, just a frightened husband and older children trying to help. Boiling snow, water, and tearing clean rags by candlelight. New life, arriving in the middle of a fight for survival. The fuel crisis became a daily terror. When the furniture was gone, you looked at the structure itself. The roof poles. Maybe you could spare one from the backside of the sadi. The interior support beam, unthinkable. Until the 5th week, when it became very thinkable. Some started tunneling into their own haystacks, burrowing in like animals to use the hay for both insulation and slow-burning fuel. Food, creativity hit new levels. That last cup of barley wasn't for eating, it was for sprouting asterisk. You'd wet it, keep it warm, and in a few days, you'd have bitter, grassy barley sprouts, vitamins, life. Bone broth was boiled. Then the bones were crushed to powder and boiled again. Every potato peeling was saved, dried by the stove, and ground into a weird, earthy flour. The animals, oh, the animals. They were wealth. They were next year's plow team. They were milk and eggs. You couldn't let them die. So, you brought them in. The chickens in crates by the door. The milk cow, tied to the far wall, her warm breath adding to the fog in the room. The smell was profound, but her body heat helped warm the house, and she was family now. A giant, quiet roommate sharing the siege. This is where the mind started to bend. Cabin fever isn't a joke when the cabin is a smoky, crowded dirt room, and the fever lasts for 6 weeks. Small annoyances became huge dramas. The way someone chewed, the sound of someone breathing. A child's constant whining could feel like a physical attack. People developed strange habits. One man was known to get up every hour to measure the snowdrift against the door with a stick, writing the number in a ledger, making a chart of the siege. A woman spent hours meticulously picking every single seed out of a straw-tick mattress, determined to plant a perfect garden if spring ever came. These rituals kept the demons of boredom and despair at bay, but some didn't win that fight. There were stories of settlers who simply gave up, who stopped eating their share, who sat in the corner and refused to speak. They were broken by the endless white and the relentless, muffled silence between storms. The strongest families weren't just those with the biggest woodpile. They were those who could tell a story, start a song, or invent a silly game on week 5. And yet, in all this hardship, they found beauty. On those rare still mornings after a storm, when the sun came out, the world was transformed. Every snowdrift was carved by the wind into dazzling sharp-edged waves. Ice crystals hung in the air, catching the sun and throwing millions of tiny rainbows, a phenomenon called diamond dust. The silence was so absolute it had a sound of its own. For a few minutes, before the cold bit through their coats, they could stand in a world of blinding, pristine, magical white. It was a cruel kind of beauty, but it was a reminder that the world was still there, and it was still astonishing. That was the true test of the long siege. It wasn't just about enduring a disaster. It was about finding a way to live, day after grinding day, in a world that had shrunk to a single, smoky room and a view of endless white. It was about maintaining some scrap of routine, some shred of kindness, some flicker of hope, when every logical signal said hope was gone. They were no longer just settlers waiting for spring. They were hibernating creatures in an earthen den. They were archivists of their own culture, repeating stories so they wouldn't be lost. They were inventors, alchemists turning leather and bone into sustenance. They were a tiny, fragile civilization, holding its breath for weeks on end. And outside, the prairie waited. Not angry, not cruel, just immensely, indifferently powerful. It had shown them its worst. storms, finally, began to lose their grip. Not all at once, but in fits and starts. A day of clear sky. Then the wind settled into a memory. The prairie lay under its snow blanket, not heaving anymore, just resting. And in that quiet, a new sound emerged. The sound of doors creaking open, and the crunch of determined footsteps. The first forays outside weren't about rescue. They were about assessment and shock. Men would climb onto their roofs, now just bumps in a smooth white ocean, and see nothing but rolling waves of snow. The barn, maybe that gentle swell over there. The neighbor's house, 2 miles east, invisible. The world had been simplified and erased. But with the assessment came a dawning, urgent need. Asterisk, find the others. Asterisk, the first heroes weren't organized rescue parties from town. They were the nearest neighbors, the ones who had spent weeks wondering if the smoke from their chimney was the only smoke left in the world. The problem was simple and deadly. How do you travel across a featureless, frozen sea without becoming lost and freezing yourself? The answer was as simple as a clothesline. People tied ropes to their doorposts. A husband would tie one end to his waist, his wife would hold the other end inside, and he would venture out, playing out the rope like a lifeline. If he found nothing, or if a new storm blew in, he could follow the rope, hand over hand, back to the door. It was humble, brilliant, and saved countless lives. For longer journeys, they looked to the people who knew this land best, the Dakota Sioux, while many settlers had seen them as strangers or even threats. In this crisis, they became essential guides. Dakota hunters, understanding the lay of the land beneath the snow like no one else, led search parties. They could read subtle dips and rises in the snow that indicated a creek bed or a fence line, the submerged roads of the old world. In the sparse towns, like De Smet or Huron, the scale of the disaster was slowly becoming clear. As soon as travel was barely possible, men formed blizzard brigades. They'd load sleds with sacks of flour, tins of kerosene, and medical supplies. Precious little of Itan set out behind teams of straining horses, following the faintest traces of old trails. What they found when they reached a claim was a lottery of tragedy and miracle. There was the heartbreak, a soddy, silent, its door frozen shut. Digging it open to find a family still huddled around a cold stove, having run out of everything: fuel, food, hope days or weeks earlier. A child, frozen just a few yards from a schoolhouse door, having circled lost in the storm. These rescuers became gravediggers in ground as hard as iron, forced to wrap bodies in canvas and lay them in snowbanks until a spring thaw would allow a proper burial. But then, there were the miracles that made them weep with relief. The rescue party that heard faint knocking from within a snow-drifted soddy, only to discover a family of 7, alive, but skeletal, who had survived by burning their haystack from the inside out, living in a cocoon within it. The schoolteacher, who had kept all 15 of her pupils alive for 3 days on a single loaf of bread and melted snow, leading them in calisthenics to keep warm. They found babies who had been nursed through the storm, wrapped in the last dry quilts, their mother's wills the only warmth that never ran out. The reunions were raw and simple. A father, part of a search party, would break through a drift to see smoke from his brother's chimney site, more beautiful than any sunrise. They wouldn't speak much, they'd just grip each other's arms, their faces saying everything. A new, desperate economy sprang up. It wasn't about money, it was about balance. A family with a little flour but no fuel would meet a family who had burned their table but had a side of bacon left. They'd trade through the snow trenches. A man who had saved his cow might have milk to give to a mother who could nurse her baby but had no food for herself. Communities weren't just rebuilding, they were rewiring themselves around pure, shared need. Communication was a slow, painful ripple. A man would make it to a neighbor, learn their news, then slog to the next claim, becoming a human newspaper. The Schulers are alive, but they lost their boy. The Johanssons are all well, and they have extra seed corn. The creek bisection line is passable. This gossip was lifelines. It was a map of survival being drawn in real time. For the children who were found, the world had become a strange and serious place. They had seen the adults afraid. They had learned the value of a single potato. When rescuers arrived with crackers and canned meat, some kids didn't cheer. They carefully, politely asked if they could save some for later. The blizzard had forced a kind of grim maturity on them. And through it all, the land offered a cruel kindness, preservation. The same cold that killed also kept. Bodies were found undecayed. Lost livestock were found frozen standing up. It was as if the storm had pressed a giant pause button on the entire territory, preserving the moment of its attack in eerie, silent tableaus for the rescuers to discover. By the time the fragile threads of connection had been woven back into something resembling a community network, the collective understanding was overwhelming. This wasn't a bad winter. This was an event, a historical line in the snow. Everyone on one side of it was a survivor. They had a shared story now, a terrible bonding knowledge of what the prairie could do when it chose to. They had looked into the white void together, and slowly, shakily, they were helping each other climb back out. The drip became a trickle. The trickle became a stream. The white world, so silent and solid for months, began to sigh and soften. Spring in Dakota that year wasn't a sudden burst of green. It was a slow, muddy revelation. As the snow melted, the land gave up its secrets, and it was a brutal accounting. The first signs were the fences, not the wooden posts, but the lines of dead birds, rabbits, and prairie chickens that had piled up against them during the storm, frozen solid. Then, the livestock, horses and cattle that had wandered or been trapped, found in drawers and gullies, preserved in strange, lifelike poses. The scale of the loss was staggering. It's estimated over 3/4 of the cattle in the territory died. For a settler, losing your oxen wasn't just losing animals. It was losing your engine, your tractor, your hope of planting a crop. Then, the harder discoveries. The graves that had been mere snow mounds now needed to be dug proper in the thawing earth. Communities held combined funerals, mourning neighbors and strangers alike. The official death toll would never be exact, maybe 1,000 people or more across the Dakota Territory. But numbers don't capture the emptiness in a half-built town, or the particular silence of a claim with no smoke rising from its sodi. The why settled over the survivors. Some packed what little they had left onto wagons and turned east, back toward crowded cities or familiar hills. The dream had been frozen out of them. The prairie had won. Their names would be marked in the land office records with a single, sad word, abandoned. But others stayed. They were thinner, poorer, and tougher. They had looked the worst winter in the eye and hadn't blinked. Leaving now would mean the storm had taken everything, including their will. So, they began the second, harder act of homesteading, starting over from below zero. This time, they built differently. They'd learned. Cellars got deeper, for storing food and for shelter. Houses were built closer together, sometimes two families sharing a larger double soddy for mutual support. More settlers invested in the new railroad coal deliveries, ensuring a stash of real fuel. The design of the sod house itself evolves: thicker walls, lower profiles, better wind facing. The storm rewrote the rules of prairie life, where the law became gospel. Signs people had vaguely noticed before were now studied like holy text. The ring around the moon, the direction of the wind at sunset, the behavior of the cattle. The concept of a blizzard kit was born: a stash of fuel, food, and candles by the door, always ready. It changed the children too. The ones who survived carried a quiet gravity. They'd learned self-reliance and the real value of a potato. They became the generation that would build the towns, schools, and churches with a pragmatic strength. Their playtime memories forever edged with the sound of howling wind. The disaster also, slowly, changed how the wider world saw the West. Newspapers back east, finally receiving the delayed reports, printed horrified stories of the Great Dakota Blizzard. It punctured the glossy myth of easy homesteading. It painted a picture not of endless opportunity, but of immense, brutal challenge. This helped slow the frantic rush a little, bringing people who were perhaps more prepared, or at least more aware. And then, just 7 years later, in January 1888, another monstrous blizzard struck, the one history would call the children's blizzard, for the many school children it caught. But this time, the reaction was different. The lessons of 1880 to 81 had seeped into the culture. More children knew to shelter in place. More teachers knew not to dismiss their classes. The death toll, while tragic, was different. They had, in a terrible way, been inoculated by the earlier storm. So, what was the legacy of that endless winter? It wasn't just a story of loss. It was a story of calibration. The settlers came with a dream that was, in many ways, too small for the land. They dreamed of tame fields and gentle seasons. The blizzard was the land's violent, clarifying reply. Asterisk, this is my true scale. This is my power. If you stay, you must respect it. Asterisk, the survivors who stayed did just that. They adjusted their dream to fit the reality. They traded a little bit of pure independence for the security of community. They traded assumption for preparation. They built a life not in spite of the prairie's power, but with a sober understanding of it. The legacy is in the deep-rooted towns that eventually grew. It's in the stubborn resilience of the Great Plains character. It's in the knowledge that sometimes survival isn't about grand heroics, but about the quiet, daily math of warmth and food, and the courage to do that math again tomorrow. The melting snow revealed the bones of the old world, but it also watered the seeds of a new one. A harder, wiser, more connected one. The white hurricane had scoured the land clean, and in the muddy, hopeful spring, the survivors got to choose what to build in its place. Asterisk, asterisk, the music softens, becoming a lullaby-like version of the main melody. The visual shows not the past, but the present-day prairie in early spring. Brown grass, a distant farmstead, a huge quiet sky. It's peaceful. Asterisk, asterisk, hash, 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 asterisk, asterisk, epilogue. The prairie sleeps again, asterisk, asterisk. Look at that same prairie today. The wind still blows, but it carries the hum of tractors, not just the rustle of grass. The miles are marked by roads and power lines, not just endless empty rises. The houses have basements, furnaces, and phones that can warn of storms days in advance. But on a still, cold winter night, if you listen past the modern hum, you can almost hear it. The echo of that wind, the memory of that silence. It's in the way a farmer still checks the almanac with a serious eye. It's in the community halls that are always ready to become shelters. It's in the stories grandparents still tell, not to scare, but to teach. Asterisk, be prepared. Look out for each other. Respect the weather, asterisk. The settlers who survived the deadliest Dakota blizzards passed more than land to their descendants. They passed down a manual for resilience, a knowledge written in frozen ink, saying that even when the world turns white and loud and endless, the human spirit has a shocking, quiet talent for endurance. We live in their legacy of warmth. So, as you drift off tonight, safe and warm, think of that not as a small thing, but as a great victory. A victory won, drip by drip, candle by candle, by ordinary people who refuse to let the cold have the last word. The prairie sleeps, and so can you. Thank you for listening. This has been Boring History for Sleep.